So, I'll be talking about Aristotle, and I'll be talking about a specific tension in economic ethics and politics between two sort of methodological commitments that he has. Right? So number one, he wants to provide some kind of definitive description of ethics and politics. He wants to talk about what ethical inquiry is, he wants to talk about the art of the state, and he wants to provide an account which will act as a definitive account, right? And there's a kind of context independence about this, where there's a kind of essence of ethics and an essence of politics, and that essence is sort of unfurled. But also, that's number two up here, he wants to be some kind of realist, right? Which he understands as this is what Aristotle understands as realism, incorporating concrete judgments about the nature of human beings based on empirical observations about the world around him, before the century afterwards, into his theoretical framework. So there's a tension between the sort of ambition to provide some kind of context-independent account of ethics and politics, and the need to be realistic, which is understood as incorporating sort of empirical, contingent, and dependent circumstances into that basic form of framework. So what I'm going to do is to talk about the sort of productive tension between these two methodological commitments, because I think that far from saying that he's sort of tripping himself up by trying to assent to both 1 and 2, what in Aristotle's own work, the tension between 1 and 2 actually leads him to some quite interesting methodological commitments and theoretical concepts. I will also try and think about the lessons Aristotle's case has for politics and ethics as such, to think about the tension between context independence and context dependence in ethics and politics as such, and I'll sort of relate the debates in Aristotle's own work to contemporary methodological debates in political philosophy. So, what am I going to do? What are the steps here? I'll give an account of the basic structure of Nicomachean ethics, the sort of methodological commitments Aristotle makes with respect to ethical inquiry. I'll connect the ethics with the politics. I'll give an account of Aristotle's statements with respect to 3 social groups, which are women, the slaves, and the poor, which are mostly in the politics. I'll talk about contemporary interpreters of Aristotle who defend him from what may be considered the sort of pernicious implications of the claims that he makes. Then I'll talk about 2 contemporary readers of Aristotle, Hannah Arendt and Alistair MacIntyre, who try to take the Aristotelian method, but try to sort of excise all his historical baggage, and I'll investigate how all of them do it. Finally, I'll discuss what implications the criticisms and sort of back and forth with respect to Aristotle's work has for doing politics and doing ethics as such. So, does this give us any kind of general lessons about how to sort of go forward with a good political philosophy or a good ethics, and what's the relationship between the two? So, starting with Nicomachean ethics, what do we understand by the term ethics? Ethics is a sort of distinctive field of inquiry, right? So, before talking about ethics specifically, we've got to get a sense of what inquiry as such is, right? So, Aristotle quote up there, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and choice, is thought to aim at some good, and for this reason the good has been. So we have to think about inquiry as being structured in this teleological sense, as aiming towards a certain kind of purpose, and we have to extrapolate from that purpose to sort of fill in the content of what the inquiry has to be. So we gotta, at this point it's a rather sort of formal and abstract characterization. We'll fill it in as we go along. So we can think about Aristotle's account of ethics as sort of nested in a general account of teleology, which is the study of purpose, right? So purposiveness, obviously, isn't restricted to Aristotle's ethics. It comes up to the theme of metaphysics, it comes up to the theme of biology, and so on and so forth. When we think about teleology and purposiveness, we have to connect that with the notion of ideal type or function, which I'll talk about more later on, right? So what I mean by ideal type is a kind of model. Whenever we're talking about a particular field of inquiry or a particular being or something like that, we have to think about that being with respect to an ideal model of what it is to be that thing, right? So an ideal human being is something we'll discuss a bit later on. And we judge individual particular instances of that thing in terms of how they strive towards that particular ideal structure. So this is sort of a basic account, but I'm now going to apply this to ethics. So ethics can be understood as trying to investigate what sort of the goal of human existence in a certain way, right? So there's a distinction between final ends and instrumental ends, which I'll clarify right now. So end roughly means purpose. So this is he's laying out the sort of very intuitive notion of ethics, which sort of recurs in ethical inquiry right now. I mean, I'll flesh this out right now. So this quotation kind of highlights that. Since there is evidently more than one end, and we choose some of these for the sake of something else, clearly not all ends are final ends, but the chief good is evidently something final, right? So we think about human action, we think about individual human actions, we act for reasons, right? And we can think about these reasons as being nested in a certain kind of hierarchy. Why do you do this? You do this because of this, you do this because of this, you do this because of this, and so on. And eventually we're able to trace this back to some kind of final end, and that's what ethics is supposed to be concerned with. So when I've been talking about the ends of man, that's what that refers to. So three concepts I have to clarify right now: happiness, virtue, and reason, right? What do we mean by happiness? Happiness, then, is something final and self-sufficient, and is the end of action. So this end we've been talking about, this final end, is clearly going to be related to this thing called happiness. However, you know, that statement in and of itself doesn't really get us very far. In the next line we have, presumably, however, to say that happiness is the chief good seems platitude, and a clearer account of what it is still desired, right? So we've got to have to flesh out this basic term happiness, which we're looking at, by reference to some other concepts, which are going to be related to virtue. So how do we make this account of happiness substantive? We talk about something called human function. Now, human function is related to what we call the ideal, what I sort of described as the ideal type earlier on, right? In order to get a sense of what the ends of man are, we've got to talk about what it means to be man, right? So we have to have some account of what human beings are, what it is to be a human being, right? So he does this by discussing his notion of human function, right? What do we mean by function? Justice does the quotation lays this out. For justice for a flute player, a sculptor, or an artist, and in general for all things that have a function or an activity, the good and the well is thought to reside in that function. And so too it would seem for man if he has a function. So that's basically just getting a sense of this is where we look for the good, right? We try and get a definitive account of what man is. Right. So what is it that man is? So we state the function of man to be a certain kind of life, and this to be an activity or actions of the soul implying a rational principle, and the function of a good man to be a good and noble performance of these. And if any action is well performed, when it is performed in accordance with the appropriate virtue. So now we've got a clearer sense of what exactly it is to be a good human being, right? It's connected to a notion of rationality, reason, I think would be a better way of rendering it. Rationality has certain pejorative connotations in this day and age. And virtue. So we've got to get a clearer sense of what those are. Right? Virtues. So there's two kinds of virtues, moral and intellectual. I'll primarily be concerned with moral virtues. Right? What's virtue? Virtue, you can think about it as a kind of set of habitual dispositions. Right? Which have to be understood in terms of capabilities or skills to act in a particular context. Right? State of character concerned with choice. And the reason I stress the context dependence of these virtues, as you'll see later on, is because they're supposed to be distinct from sort of abstract rules which you think about intellectually. They're sort of very concrete. I mean, one way to kind of relate this to a more down-to-earth notion is to think about something like street smarts, which has gained a lot of currency, right, since the 80s, as a piece of youth slang. But anyhow, right? I mean, but the core idea is the same. It's contextual, it's situation dependent, and it relates to the skill and character of the individual person. Also, I'll gloss the doctrine of the mean. There's lots of interpretive issues that I'm sort of dancing over here, but all I need to do right now is just establish all of these concepts as a basic framework for the discussion that will follow. We can understand virtues as sort of means between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. So courage is a mean between rashness and cowardice, right? You know, if you're not courageous enough, you're cowardly. If you're too courageous, you're rash. Modesty is a mean between shyness and shamelessness, and so on and so forth. This brings me to practical wisdom, which is what the sort of reason talk earlier was kind of referring to. Practical wisdom, I think, is sort of one of the most interesting concepts in Aristotle's ethics. It's kind of one thing that keeps the whole show going. So we've just talked about what this rational mean is. A person's capability to determine what this mean is depends on their practical wisdom, right? So because these virtues are situation dependent, practical wisdom takes the form of a certain kind of situational know-how, right? And he makes the distinction between practical wisdom and theoretical wisdom, or scientific knowledge, right here in this paragraph. No one deliberates about things that are invariable, or about things that are impossible for him to do. Therefore, since scientific knowledge involves demonstration, but there is no demonstration of things whose first principles are variable, and since it is impossible to deliberate about things which are of necessity, practical wisdom cannot be scientific knowledge or art. So this is just giving a sense of the distinct nature of ethical inquiry, right? You're certainly not going to give some kind of theoretical demonstration or proof. What you're going to do is establish these loose skills and capabilities in order for people to act in particular contexts, right? So it's very much sort of anti-intellectual in that sense. So reiterating that point, practical wisdom must be a reasoned and true state of capacity to act with regard to human goods. So now I have to sort of draw the connection between the Nicomachean ethics and the politics. So the way to do this is to think about the relationship between virtue and law, right? So the quotation here sort of illustrates that. But it is difficult to get up from youth a right training towards virtue if he has not been brought up toward the right laws. For to live temperately and hardly is not pleasant to most people, especially when they're young. Right. Now, the idea here is that this account of virtue and human function that we're getting now has to be institutionally structured. We have to have political institutions, social institutions, cultural institutions in order to inculcate these. Because of the sort of nature-nurture account he has about how exactly we develop these virtues, he stresses the role of laws quite a bit. And given that we have to sort of discuss legality in the formation of virtue, we're going to have to give an account of what law is, and we're going to have to give an account of what politics is. Right? So, again, if you want to make men good, you have to do it through laws. For through laws that we become good. Right? He's now basically emphasizing the importance of legislation. Now, note this is book 10, so it's right at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics. It's a nice sort of transitional stage taking us from the ethics to the politics. So, the politics. What's politics? Politics can be understood for Aristotle according to, as a study of human association, right? The quotation here. This is the first line of the politics. Observation shows us that every city or polis is a species of association, and secondly, that all associations come into being for the sake of some good. Right? So again, this notion of good, right? Good here again should be understood closer to the purpose, the sort of end that I've been bandying about before. We have to now think, in order to be political thinkers, to understand the good, which sort of will ground our notion of association. And in order to get that good, we have to go from the account of man that we've already kind of fleshed out from the virtues and practical wisdom, and think about the needs of man and the nature of man, which will ground our account of the association. So, I mean, this is a kind of arbitrary divide, but it sort of helps you to get a sense of what he's talking about. Man has certain material needs, and he has certain social needs, and corresponding to this, you have two strata of organizational structure, right? Oikos and polis. I mean, there's villages as well, but I mean, that's sort of less relevant to my discussion of it. You can think about oikos, which is basically the household. It's very much spatial concept, which will be very important later on. as the sort of material sphere where necessity is kind of provided for, right? And the sort of relationships which hold in the household allow for the polis, which we'll discuss in a second, to flourish. So this is, I mean, a sort of slight side note, Xenophon's notion of sort of household management, which is sort of birthplace of modern economics. Now the polis is sort of a space where citizens are allowed to exercise their deliberative capacity, right? Now, we've established these accounts of two needs. Now, what we want to talk about is that some needs are sort of more important to human beings than others, right? So, we've talked about social needs, we've talked about material needs. Deliberation and the ability to speak is a lot more important than the fulfillment of material needs, right? Which relates to this quotation here, right? Man is by nature a political animal, right? Now, what does it mean to be a political animal? The ability to deliberate about the good, right? Rather than produce mere meaningless sounds, which animals do, right? We're able to say, this is good, this is bad, talk about advantages and disadvantages. And there's sort of a conception of deliberative reason, which is implied here, which is again connecting it back to what we've been saying about the ethics, right? It's very much the two accounts of the good that we have in the ethics and the account of political institutions that we have here are very much connected, and they should be understood as so. So what about the Oikos? We'll be talking about the Oikos quite a lot. It's sort of the dark heart of Aristotle's politics. I mean, lots of people are sort of, I mean, in a sense, I'm doing this, but lots of other people do it as well, pointing to statements in the politics which refer to the household, and like, oh, you know, that's really bad, and so on. So, the polis is the realm of the good, and the realm where man exercises his highest capacities. The Oikos is this kind of lesser realm, but lesser not understood in a normative sense, but lesser understood in the sense that it's sort of a necessary evil, because it deals with, you know, our material flourishing. And we've got to eat if we're going to deliberate about the good. It's sort of a precondition, right? And thus, sort of arrangements in the household, right, such as those between male and female, and sort of slaves and masters and so on, have sort of an air of practical convenience, right? So there's very much, the arrangements that we have in the household are very much sort of intended to be founded on these empirical judgments. So this distinction between oikos and polis will sort of be interesting for us to start an essay later on. There's another distinction between zoe and bios, which kind of maps onto this. But we'll talk about that in a second. So we're talking about the constitution, it's not really that important. Now, the fly in the soup, which is what I like to call it, which is kind of the sort of dark part of the account, which is less appreciated. These are the sort of contingent historical judgments Aristotle makes about these particular social groups. Right? I'll argue that these remarks that he makes, which will incriminate him in various ways, I'll read these out, aren't just incidental, but sort of necessary to the structure of his political theory and by extension to his ethics. So the sort of connection I've established there. So the three groups about which these choice remarks will be made are the women, the slaves, and the poor. So Aristotle's account of women should be understood in the background of the distinction between the household and the polis, right? And again, everything he's going to say that I'm going to show you in a second has to be understood in terms of the labor of women help provide in the household. They play a particular role in terms of caring for the child. They play a particular role in terms of providing emotional labor. Aristotle doesn't have the term emotional labor, but it's a rather useful term to think about the role that women have for providing for these very basic social needs, which are not considered to be political in the highfalutin sense, right? As in highfalutin sense being deliberating about the good, right? So note very much that I'm situating women in the household because he does that, as we'll see in a second, and not in the polis, although there's debate about this, which we'll talk about. Here we are. The relation to male to female is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. That's number one. The female has it, the deliberative element, because that's a clarification because this is part of the broader sentence. But it lacks authority, right? So the idea is his account of women is very much that by virtue of their not having deliberation, right? So sorry, by virtue of their not having authority, although they have some capacity to deliberate and reason, they have to enter into this kind of subjugation relationship with respect to men. I mean, subjugation is a sort of, possibly a stronger word for this. I'll sort of clarify what exactly this relationship is, but they have to enter into this kind of subordination relationship with men in the household, and they're sort of precluded from entering the polis. I'm not suggesting that we read Aristotle as a misogynist here, at least not in a certain sense. He's certainly not, so, I mean, a sort of first reading of this it might seem that he's opposed to, he somehow sees the female as sort of like a lower form of life. I mean, I don't think it's quite as strong as that. So just sort of hedging away from that particular reading. But charitable readings are plenty here, and Aristotle scholars have been at work. It all hinges on how you take the words lax authority. Right? Charitable readings stress the kind of contingency of the statement. So Alistair MacIntyre and Whose Justice, Which Rationality. Aristotle was just being realistic about the abilities of women in subjugated society. Right? MacIntyre points out that women were irrationally dominated in ancient Greece, and Aristotle was just simply suggesting, given this fact, that it would be most expedient for women to enter into this kind of relationship with men in the household. Harold Levy adds to this and sort of points out that there may even be some guarded optimism based on a certain reading of the politics that women may be allowed to enter the post in some kind of limited capacity. So again, it's not. This is what I was sort of saying earlier about not stressing too much the sort of misogynist aspect of this. This rereading is kind of paternalistic. I don't think that these sort of charitable rereadings assuage the doubts people have about this kind of relationship, the kind of systematic inequity, the implicit sort of idea that women need to be educated in the sort of pejorative sense of the word, which implies a political inequality between the educator and the educated. All the kind of problems that we see when we read the statements we read earlier. So that's women. Slaves. Again, slaves have to be understood in the context of the household, right? Slavery is a certain kind of necessary social arrangement in order to create material abundance. We just have to do this, right? You may want to be sanctimonious about it, but given certain differences in abilities between men, it is just a sort of necessary feature of the household. So I'll read the second quote because it sort of helps to illustrate this a little better. It is nature's intention to erect a difference between the bodies of free men and those of slaves, giving the latter strength for the physical duties of life, but by making the former upright in carriage, though useless for physical labor, useful for the various purposes of civic life. Right? So the idea here is that, given that you've got these necessary physical differences, we might as well enter into these particular relationship, the relationship in this case being master and slave, right? Someone has to carry the carriage, and it might as well be the guy who can't reason very well, but who can carry people across from your house to the political sphere. Again, there are caveats. There's Aristotle's distinction between slave by nature and slave by war, right? So what sort of admissible form of slavery is slave by nature, where we can identify these differences that he's laid out, right? But if you have, because of military conflict or some other contingent event, people who aren't slaves by nature, having entered into a particular slave relationship, that's not admissible in quite the way that we want to talk about. I think this is a bad distinction, given the sort of prevalence of military conflict across history. Drawing that distinction precisely is actually quite hard, even in 4th century Athens, right? Given this, it depends on how you define war, right? There are those people who say the state itself is founded on violence and so on, but, So here, Pellegrin actually defends Aristotle and says that given that Aristotle has a kind of emphasis on the expedient nature of slavery, right, so it's convenient, he may well have disapproved of much of the actual slavery in his time. Many of the actual slave relationships that Aristotle may have encountered, or sort of an empirical account of slavery in 4th century Athens, may well have not met Aristotle's criteria for goodness, right? But again, this may be true, but the worries seem to stand. Is the relationship not still paternalistic? Is the relationship, is the idea that there are these natural differences between people not objectionable to sort of modern readers of Aristotle in a certain sense, right? Even if we read him as this kind of paternalist who treats the slave as a kind of, a sort of bonded laborer, who may even have material compensation, right? And who may even be given, good meals from time to time. So I'll end with his remarks on the poor. This is a bit less apparent as women and slaves, but it's there. He will have a kind of paternalistic attitude towards the poor. You know, there's this general fear which recurs in Western political theory about poor, sort of ruled by the poor and democracy being mob rule, with the implication that, you know, the poor, because they don't have any leisure, as the quote suggests, won't have any time to engage in these sophisticated deliberations about the good. Again, the stress here is not, oh, I hate the poor. The stress here is, given the contingent empirical circumstances and the nature of poverty in Athens, the poor won't have the particular capacities which we desire in order to enter the political debate, right? And the middle class, you know, kind of the inverse of this, do, right? Because they're not sort of enchanted with great wealth, but also they're not the kind of raging hordes of the poor, because, you know, being middle class, this gives me a great sort of sense of class solidarity. Anyway, I mean, and then there's a general idea that when democracies don't have a middle class, when there's widespread impoverishment, they'll be revolt. But what's lurking in here is a sort of implicit, paternalistic understanding that the poor are somehow lesser, right? Which, you know, he does have grounds to, I mean, you can claim based on based on good economic history that he does have grounds to make this claim, but the way you can cash this out politically is may have certain dangerous consequences, especially when you've otherized the poor in some way, right? As in, you want to talk about the poor as sort of the unreasonable, and you want to talk about the middle class as the reasonable, and that kind of dichotomous relationship seems to me to have dangerous political consequences. So, also, the notion of practical wisdom can take on a certain sinister connotation here, where if you want to talk about poverty as the poor as sort of unreasonable in this sense, you can say that they're so brute and degenerate and, you know, and so base that they can't exercise these practical skills and capabilities, right? It's a kind of animalization of the poor, which is, again, the political consequences of this were it to, you know, if these sort of concepts are employed in practice, are very dangerous. So again, there are defenses of Aristotle. The one interesting one is Martha Nussbaum and Amartya Sen, who sort of claim Aristotle to be some kind of modern social democrat, where, you know, there's a kind of, hey, you know, an Aristotelian polis is completely compatible with some notion of welfare and redistribution, right? And the idea that, you know, the poor should be given aid is that Aristotle doesn't object to that anywhere, right? But again, that's not really the worry here. The worry here is that the sort of conceptual relationship that you create when you sort of brand a group of people uneducated and unreasonable has dangerous political consequences. Right? That's the general issue. Right. So, why do I feel the need to beat Aristotle with this rather short stick? It's very easy as a contemporary reader to just look at these statements, which seem outrageous to us. Right? The reason I do this is because it's very important to figure out what exactly we can and what exactly we can't take from Aristotle, particularly because of the long shadow he casts in Western political philosophy. Right? So the question of whether we can't simply weed out the flies in the soup, but fly in the ointment is the traditional phrase, but I like soup because it must convey some of the disgust sort of you feel when these statements are read. And also, it helps convey my general thesis that you know, the soup is still disgusting if you take the flies out, right? So I attack Aristotle not to bludgeon him for being who he was, right, a relatively well-off 4th century Athenian, but to make a point about the situatedness and the embodiment of political theory. The fact that what appear to be statements which are simply products of, you know, him being in his time are not actually separatable from the highfalutin ideals that I was talking about from the first part of the presentation. So for the latter part of the presentation, I'm just going to talk about a couple of contemporary Aristotelians who tried to get the fly out of the soup, right? To demonstrate how both the sort of historical, the ethical normative form and the historical content are sort of bound together. Yeah, I mean, if you want me to go into detail on either of these thinkers, you can ask me questions about them. I'll just gloss their sort of reading of Aristotle for a bit. Alistair MacIntyre McIntyre wrote a very interesting book called After Virtue. I recommend it to everybody. It's generally considered to be one of the most important books on ethics in the 20th century. Right. Basically, again, ask me questions about this. I'm not going to gloss it too much. There's in modernity, since the 19th century, we've had big problems with ethics. We've lost our way in all these various forms. And in order to fix that, we have to go back to Aristotle. Now, what does that mean? That means we need to recover Aristotle's notion of situated ethics, right? We need to have a sense that we are part of a particular context, i.e. we're part of a polis in a concrete sense. And we don't have that for various reasons. I'm not going to go into them. And the sort of account of virtue and the account of the polis that I just outlined should be used to re-energize sort of contemporary politics. I mean, yeah, again, if you want details for McIntyre, please ask me about them. So we don't need to make the same concrete judgments that Aristotle did. McIntyre basically says this outright. Just because he said X, Y, Z about women and slaves doesn't mean that we have to, right? We can simply assume that the polis cultivates excellence and virtue without making any commitments about which social groups have virtue or are reasonable, right? So getting the fly out of the soup. I think this is unsatisfying. For three reasons. I'll expand on the last one, because the second and the third one, because I think they're the most important. A lot of these notions, like the notion of teaching excellence and the distinction between the oikos and the polis, contain an implicit paternalism, even if you sort of wipe all the historical baggage from them, right? Talking about a political relationship as a relationship not between citizen and ruler, but between teacher and student, is dangerous for various reasons, right? Yes, there's some aspect of public knowledge, and you certainly have to know about what exactly a policy is. You sort of have to have certain sort of basic level of knowledge, but the sort of implicit superiority that a teacher has over a student should not be a useful parallel to draw when talking about a relationship between citizen and ruler. Anyway, Hannah Arendt, she's also one of the most important figures of the 20th century. I'm going to discuss two of her books here. So, Human Condition, which is the majority of the discussion on the origins of totalitarianism, which is interesting, but I won't talk about it very much. Again, there's this whole account of how us in modernity in the 20th century have lost sight of various truths that the ancients held. Arendt focuses on the distinction between oikos and polis. We confuse the economic space of necessity, right, the household, with the political space of freedom, right, the sort of primacy that material concerns have in our political discussion, rather than sort of far-flung discussions of virtue. We need to recover a notion of the polis which allows us to be free and virtuous in the way that Aristotelian citizens of the polis were. Now, this Schiavel theory of the polis, I can go over this if people want me to. Political society is like an achievement, right, in sort of circumstances where we're driven by all kinds of loyalties like class and race. We kind of reach out and recognize a sort of person in the polis as someone who's authentically different to us, but also recognize that we can enter into a community with him, right? He's not simply black or proletarian or whatever. He's sort of an authentic, individual, virtuous human being, and on the basis of that mutual ground of trust, you build a political state. And again, this is sort of there's a sort of interesting combination of sort of her influences, which are more recent in the 20th century, and sort of Aristotelian political theory going on here. Yeah, there's stuff here, I won't go over it. If you want me to talk about it, I will. However, the same issues that we've been glossing all the time about structural problems in these concepts come thick and fast. Can there be a distinction, even in principle, between economic questions and political questions? I don't think so. It seems to me that questions, it's one of the reasons Aristotle makes this distinction is because he sees questions of the economy, questions of the household, as sort of purely technocratic questions which can simply be managed in a sort of calculative sense. I don't think so. I think that that's true if you adopt a particular stance, right? If you are a sort of rich Athenian and you have to get your slaves to increase produce, that is a technocratic question, right? It is not a question of political debate what the crop yield will be if you employ 2 rather than 3 slaves, right? However, the political question is whether there should be slaves at all, right? This is, if you assume the sort of relations which govern the household are kind of fixed, static, and ahistorical, then yeah, sure, I can see how that's simply a technical question, but I don't think we should make that assumption. And the second doubt that I'll raise is that this whole notion of a community of trust is quite dangerous. In the sense that a community of trust is implicitly built on a certain, a sort of implicit other outside the community who's distrusted. So that inclusion-exclusion dynamic is kind of going on here as well, right? And you can see how these sort of ideas can be repurposed for kind of very nasty kind of nationalism, where, the community of trust that we build, the hand that we reach out to, the sort of other citizens of our own nation, yeah. And the others or the immigrants or whatever. So the problem here is that both Arendt and McIntyre are trying to come up with the form of Aristotle's theory without the content. I don't think that's possible because of the various sort of structural issues such as the distinction between the Oikos and the Polis, and sort of the implicit sort of elitism and the notion of education and all of the other issues that I've kind of glossed. And the lesson I think we should take from this is that as political philosophers, or as readers of classic texts, we have to pay a lot more attention to the historical situatedness of political thinkers than we've hitherto done, right? McIntyre himself is not guilty of this for reasons I will tell you, for reasons I will elucidate when we talk. But generally, there's a strand in political theory nowadays which suggests that we have to go about political theory in this kind of abstract, normative sense, where as rational human beings we can construct rules which are sort of completely context independent and can sort of give us a notion of the good regardless of which society we're in. I don't think that's viable, and I think the sort of debate between contemporary readings of Aristotle and Aristotle's own historical baggage kind of demonstrates why that distinction isn't viable. And I think this raises sort of fascinating possibilities for the collaboration between political philosophy and history and studies of classical civilization.